Okay, this will be part 3 in my video series of celebrities who have just really bizarre, odd backgrounds, just really unbelievable backgrounds in a lot of cases. And I already made a part 1 and a part 2 where I talked about 5 other celebrities in each one who come from just strange families and have odd backgrounds. I'll link these 2 videos in the description of this video. And we'll go ahead and get into part 3. And first up, we have Olivia Newton-John, who might have the strangest backstory of anyone I covered so far. Obviously, everybody knows her from Grease and Physical, a number of other songs and movies. She was a real big deal for a while. And she has quite the family tree. So her mother was Irene Newton-John, who was the daughter of Max Born. And Max Born was a Jewish scientist who won the Nobel Prize in 1954. And he's regarded as one of the greatest physicists of all time. He was a very close associate of a number of very famous scientists, including Albert Einstein. So Olivia Newton-John's grandfather was Nobel Prize winner Max Born. And through this side of her family, she was directly related to just a number of very prominent German Jewish scientists and people involved in the law and pharmacology. And she's even related to Martin Luther, who was one of the most important religious figures of all time. And she mentions in her biography how she's also related to a number of Spanish nobility and Spanish kings as well. So that's her mother's side of the family, but her father is the really interesting one. Her father was Brinley Newton-John, and he was involved in education. Then he got involved in World War II, and he became a wing commander in the British Air Force, and then he became an MI6 agent. And the official story goes that he knew fluent German, so he got involved in code breaking with MI6, and one of the people he worked very closely with was this guy, Alan Turing, who's described as the father of modern day computing and the father of artificial intelligence. And during World War II, they worked on code breaking the Enigma device, which was the coding system that Germany used in World War II to send encrypted messages and plan their attacks. And being able to figure this out was considered one of the main reasons that the Allies won the war. So they kind of make her father sound like he was this almost like nerdy codebreaker type guy, but there was seemingly way more going on here because almost unbelievably, Brinley Newton-John was also involved in the capture of Rudolf Hess. And this has always been regarded as possibly the greatest mystery of World War II. And it's honestly quite amazing that Olivia Newton-John's father just happened to be involved with it. And the quick story is that Rudolf Hess was basically Hitler's second or third in command for a long time, and in May of 1941, and this was even before the US entered the war, he made a secret flight to England to negotiate a peace treaty between England and Germany, but no one knows if he went on behalf of Hitler or if he just decided to fly to England on his own to try to negotiate this peace treaty. But anyway, his plane crashed and he was taken into custody. He was questioned by the British, and he claimed he had amnesia and couldn't remember basically any of the details about his life. He was asked what year he was born, and he answered incorrectly. So a lot of people actually believe that this was a body double and not the real Rudolf Hess. But whoever this was, he was eventually taken into custody. And during the Nuremberg trials, he claimed that he still had amnesia and he couldn't remember all this stuff. And he was sentenced to life in prison for Rudolf Hess's war crimes. And in 1979, this book was written by a surgeon who examined him, and he claimed that this wasn't the real Rudolf Hess because the man he'd examined had no scars from injuries that Rudolf Hess had received during the war. And then in 1987, when he was still in prison, he randomly committed suicide at age 93. So who exactly this person was is a real mystery, and the whole story of what was going on with this peace mission that he was on is really shrouded in secrecy. Some people believe there were just some serious behind-the-scenes negotiations going on between some very powerful people, and this mysterious mission was part of some sort of backroom deal that was being negotiated. It's definitely a rabbit hole if you look into the whole Rudolf Hess mystery, but it is just incredibly odd that Olivia Newton-John's father just happens to be one of the people who captured and interrogated Rudolf Hess. And another interesting thing is that after the war, Brinley Newton-John became headmaster for this elite boarding school named Cambridgeshire School for Boys. And there are all these influential people who attended this school, politicians, people like that. And strangely, 2 members of Pink Floyd attended this school as well. Roger Waters of Pink Floyd even claims that another brick in the wall when they sing "We Don't Need No Education" It was inspired by his time at this school, and it definitely just seems like a really odd career arc to go from this MI6 agent in the war who was seemingly very important and very high up, considering all the things that he was involved in, then just go back into education after the war as an administrator for this school for boys. And if you look at his Wikipedia page, it's honestly almost hilarious with all the random stuff that's crammed in there. University administrator, professor, MI6 intelligence officer, wing commander, cracked the Enigma code, captured Rudolph Hess, and oh, by the way, he was the father of Olivia Newton-John, who was this massive pop star, probably the biggest pop star in the world for a stretch. And Olivia Newton-John is very interesting. She was a huge, just absolutely massive star in the 1970s and 80s. Then she kind of disappeared. And then in the early 2000s, she was involved in a really bizarre Hollywood mystery when her longtime boyfriend just vanished off the face of the earth in 2005. And this is an incredibly strange story. So her boyfriend of 9 years was this guy. His name is Patrick McDermott, and he was actually born in Korea as Kim Chong-nam. And then it was claimed he was adopted by a US family when he was younger. And somehow he eventually became some sort of cameraman or lighting designer in Hollywood. I couldn't really find many details of like how he broke into Hollywood or what movies he worked on, but he eventually dated Olivia Newton-John for over 9 years. And then in 2005, he went on a fishing trip on this boat right here named Freedom, and he vanished during the trip, and he has never been seen again. His body was never found, and there was this massive mystery surrounding whether he drowned at sea or whether he staged his death to disappear. It was claimed that he was in debt and owed child support to his ex-wife, who was an actress named Yvette Kniper, so that could have explained why he would have vanished. But the whole thing is very strange because Olivia Newton-John claimed he broke things off with her shortly before the boating trip. He left her a goodbye note and roses shortly before he left. So if the reason he vanished was because he was in debt, it seems kind of odd that he would break things off with this like multi-millionaire girlfriend. And there have been a number of investigations into his disappearance over the years. There was a really big Dateline NBC investigation into it. And in 2010, a private investigator named Philip Klein claimed that he'd found him in Mexico, and he believed he'd gone there because he was in debt and he wanted his son to have a $100,000 insurance policy on his life. And the plot thickened when this Philip Klein wrote a book about his investigation, and Patrick McDermott's ex-wife, Yvette Kniper, and she was the one he supposedly owed all this child support money to, she basically blasted him, blasted the book, and she even wrote a letter to Jeff Bezos asking him to get the book taken off of Amazon. And this Philip Klein noted how strange that was because he'd worked on a number of missing person cases over the years, and usually he noted how it was usually the family members who were the ones who were trying to get as much attention out of the case as possible, as many eyes looking into it as they could. So he found it very strange that the ex-wife was the one who was trying to get his book taken off of Amazon and trying to get his investigation stopped. And over the years, there have been a number of sightings of this Patrick McDermott. Some were proved to be false, others are still a mystery, but he's never officially been found since he disappeared in 2005. So it's a huge, huge mystery. It's very bizarre. And it seems to me like there was just way, way, way more to this guy's story, whether he was some sort of handler or he disappeared to escape the mafia or the mob or something like that, because it really seems pretty extreme to just vanish to some remote villages in Central America over some debt that you owe. And it also seems very odd that his family is blocking the investigation, seemingly. Definitely a pretty shitty story here. But anyway, that's Olivia Newton-John. Just a really insanely strange backstory between her grandpa winning the Nobel Prize to all these prominent people she's related to her father being an MI6 agent involved in the capture of Rudolph Hess. I mean, it just really doesn't get any weirder than her background. And next up, we have Mariah Carey, who everybody knows. And Mariah Carey probably has the most ludicrous story of breaking into Hollywood and getting her big break than anyone you've ever heard. So she did the whole like move to New York thing right after she graduated high school. And allegedly, she worked all these odd jobs to survive, tried everything to break into the music industry in her free time. Eventually, she became friends with this lady, Brenda Starr, who was kind of like a minor singing star, and Mariah Carey was a backup singer for a few of her songs. And Brenda Starr was going to a music industry party one night and she asked Mariah Carey to come along. Mariah Carey claims in this book that she didn't want to go to the party, which makes a lot of sense because if you're a struggling singer trying to break into the music industry and somebody invites you to a party where there's going to be a whole bunch of music executives there, obviously there's absolutely no way at all that you would be interested in something like that. But anyway, Brenda Starr eventually convinced Mariah Carey to go to this party, and there were all these music executives there. And while she was at the party, Mariah Carey just handed her demo tape to the head of Columbia Records, Tommy Mottola. And Tommy Mottola listened to the demo tape right away in his limousine on the way home from the party. And as he was listening to it, he demanded that his limo driver turn around and go back to the party because he had to talk to the girl who was on the tape. But Mariah Carey had left the party and she hadn't included her name or contact info on the tape. So Tommy Mottola had no idea how to find this mysterious girl. Some reports say he looked for her for 2 weeks before he eventually found her. But he did finally find her, and he met with her and her mother that very afternoon after they talked on the phone, and he signed her to a big record deal. And this all happened when she was 19. They spent $1 million promoting her debut album, which is almost like an unprecedented amount for an unknown singer. And then she ended up marrying Tommy Mottola when she was 23 and he was 43, so definitely a big age gap there. And probably the most interesting thing has to do with Mariah Carey's sister. So her sister Allison had a really rough life. She became a prostitute, she was homeless, addicted to drugs, and eventually this Allison Carey came out and said that she'd been taken to all these satanic ritual parties when she was a child and she'd been abused, and she like went into graphic detail about what happened at these parties, described men in robes and witnessing some just really horrific stuff. And her brother also confirmed that he'd been taken to satanic rituals as a child as well. And they both said that they didn't know if Mariah Carey had ever been taken to these occult parties because Mariah Carey was much younger than them. But you got to think that it's probably a pretty safe bet that she was. And this was a big story when Allison Carey came out about this. It was even mentioned in the mainstream media. Now, her sister ended up suing their mother because she claimed that the abuse that she suffered at these parties had really messed her up mentally. And that's why her life had turned into just kind of like a big disaster. And she described this castle like mansion where these parties had occurred in Huntington, New York. And, that's where they grew up. And some people have speculated that this mansion here, which is known as Oheka Castle, could have been the place where this all went down. This is in Huntington, New York, and this is just a massive, massive mansion that was once the second largest private residence in the United States of America. And it was built by this guy. His name is Otto Kahn, who was this investment banker back in the early 1900s. And interestingly, he was also chairman of the New York Metropolitan Opera, and Mariah Carey's mom, Patricia, was an opera singer. So there is that connection, although Otto Kahn died in 1934, so that would have been before her mother's time. But if this mansion was used as some sort of gathering spot for some esoteric group, it still could have been used for that after Otto Kahn died and the mansion stayed in his family. And another really curious thing that happened only about a year ago was that Mariah Carey's sister Allison and her mother died on the exact same day. And it was described as a really tragic turn of events, and all these articles talked about how devastated Mariah Carey was. Obviously, the odds of them both dying on the exact same day of natural causes are pretty astronomical. So you do wonder if there was more going on here. And again, Allison Carey claimed that she didn't know if Mariah Carey herself attended these parties because Mariah Carey was much younger than her, but it really does seem like something did happen to Mariah Carey at some point. So there's been a lot out there that's been written about monarch programming, which is this mind control programming that it's claimed a lot of celebrities and women in particular are subjected to. Basically, these people are subjected to this severe trauma and abuse, and this causes the mind to split into different personalities as sort of a defense mechanism. And through this abuse, these different personalities are created and they're compartmentalized in monarch programming. And these personalities are entirely different from each other, and they can be accessed by psychologists and people who know what they're doing when it comes to this. A lot of times, this is what multiple personality disorder is, and it's called monarch programming because the monarch butterfly starts out as a caterpillar, then it transforms into a butterfly, which is symbolic of the transforming of someone's personality. And Mariah Carey is notorious for her love of butterflies, monarch butterflies in particular. She's always photographed wearing butterfly clothing, butterfly jewelry. Her fragrance had a butterfly logo. She's got a butterfly tattoo. And she had a hit song named Butterfly and a big album named Butterfly. And she even had her own record label at one point, which she named Monarch Entertainment. So that's definitely a really curious name that she decided to go with. And very interestingly, a few years ago, Mariah Carey came out and talked about how she struggled with bipolar disorder for pretty much her whole adult life. So it definitely seems like something happened with her in her mind at some point. It's always been speculated that Tommy Mottola was like a handler or involved in whatever went on with her in some way. And Tommy Mottola was the guy who Michael Jackson kind of regarded as his like arch nemesis. Michael Jackson just hated Tommy Mottola with a passion. He would constantly refer to him as the devil, quote unquote. He repeatedly gave speeches against Tommy Mottola and held protests, and he would always call him the devil, the devil. So it's kind of interesting, but yeah, the whole Mariah Carey thing is definitely a wild one. Just the story of her getting her big break is pretty much the most ludicrous story ever, and the claims of her sister are definitely really eye-opening, and even just the mental issues that she's had, you got to think something way more is going on with her. And next up, we have Freddie Prinze Jr., whose father was Freddie Prinze Sr., and Freddie Prinze Sr. died of suicide, quote unquote, in 1977 at only 22 years old. And man, this is just a massive, really interesting mystery. You never really see it talked about or mentioned. Most people have no idea who Freddie Prinze Sr. even was. But the story of his death is such an interesting story. I did like a 20, 30-minute video on his death already. I'll include that link in the description, but I just wanted to kind of rip through his story real quick and summarize it. And I've also learned some really interesting details about his death since I made this video. So I did wanted to kind of provide a quick update on a few things that I've learned since I made this video. And like I mentioned, nobody ever talks about Freddie Prinze anymore. No one really has any idea who he was, but this guy was a massive, massive deal for a while. He was a comedian and he blew up quicker and bigger than any comedian has ever blown up. He blew up faster than Eddie Murphy, faster than Richard Pryor, faster than Jim Carrey. I mean, his rise to fame is just unprecedented, and he was a massive deal for a while. And it all started in December of 1973. This was only 6 months after he had graduated high school. He was only 19 years old, and he appeared on the Johnny Carson show, and he freaking killed it. Johnny Carson invited him to come over and sit down and chat after his performance, and Freddie Prinze was actually the very first person who Johnny Carson, the very first amateur comic who Johnny Carson called over to sit down and chat after his performance. And Johnny Carson just flat out told Freddie Prinze during this interview that, hey kid, you're going to be a star one day. You've got it. So again, Freddie Prinze is 19 years old. He's on national television 6 months after graduating high school. And Johnny Carson is telling him, you're going to be a huge star. And that's exactly what happened, because after The Tonight Show, he was cast in this show, Chico and the Man. And this Chico and the Man show was a sensation. It was often the number one ranked show for the entire week, and it ended its first year on the air as the third highest ranked show. So this show was extremely popular. Freddie Prinze was the star of the show, and this turned him into just a total teen idol. He was always on magazines. He was, Puerto Rican. He was half Puerto Rican, and he was about the only Puerto Rican movie star there was. So he was, very unique in that regard. And he guest hosted the Tonight Show at only 21 years old. So he filled in for Johnny Carson when he's only 21. He dated all these famous women, and then it all came to an end in 1977 when he was 22 years old, and he shot himself. And there is so much strange stuff going on here. I talk about all the strange aspects in the longer video that I did. Interestingly, he died 33 hours after he shot himself. You see this number pop up a lot. I talk about that in the longer video. And the official story is just that, oh, well, he, got addicted to drugs, and fame was just too much for him too soon, and he was too young, and it all was just overwhelming. So he ended his life. But there are a million weird things that went on with the Freddie Prinze quote unquote suicide. One of the real mysteries involves this guy right here. His name is William Kroger. He was Freddie Prinze's psychiatrist, and he was one of the main, foremost experts in the world on hypnosis. He'd written a number of books about hypnosis, and he studied under Dr. Jolly West, who was one of the main people involved in the government's MK Ultra mind control program. And this William Kroger was really involved in using hypnosis during surgery. So he would hypnotize people to not feel pain. And this was used in surgery sometimes as a substitute for anesthesia. And there are reports of, people having these major surgeries done and they haven't been under anesthesia at all. They've only been hypnotized by William Kroger. So it's crazy, crazy story. He was also involved in hypnotizing women to not feel pain during childbirth. And there are many stories of this being successful. So it's crazy how powerful this guy was as a hypnotist. And again, this was Freddie Prinze's psychiatrist, and this William Kroger was using hypnotism on Freddie Prinze as part of their meetings and their therapy that they were working on. And he would apparently just hypnotize Freddie Prinze all the time. And even very interestingly, on the day before he shot himself, Freddie Prinze had met with William Kroger and he had been hypnotized by him. And Freddie Prinze even spent that night, which was his last night on Earth, at the home of his psychiatrist, William Kroger. And then the very next day, when Freddie Prinze was acting all crazy, William Kroger was summoned to Freddie Prinze's apartment just a few hours before he killed himself. So the question was always like, well, was he potentially hypnotized into killing himself? And anyway, William Kroger ended up paying almost $1 million as part of a lawsuit that Freddie Prinze's family brought. So something more was definitely going on here. I get into it in the full video, so I won't cover that here. But another interesting thing about Freddie Prinze is he was extremely interested in the JFK assassination, borderline obsessed with the JFK assassination from the sound of it. He had his own copy of the Zapruder film that he would just constantly watch and constantly show people. One of his very good friends was Dick Gregory, who most people know was definitely a very prominent researcher with a lot of connections. And I talk about Freddie Prinze and the JFK assassination in the longer video that I did, but one thing I've learned since then came from this book here. It's called Hidden History by Donald Jeffries. And in this book, Donald Jeffries talks about how he worked for Mark Lane for a stretch in the 1970s on Mark Lane's investigation into the JFK assassination. Mark Lane was a very prominent JFK researcher back then. He wrote a number of books about the JFK assassination. And Donald Jeffries talks of how Mark Lane told him about receiving a phone call from Freddie Prinze. And on this phone call, Freddie Prinze said he was trying to put together a telethon with a bunch of celebrities to raise awareness of some of the mysterious aspects of the JFK assassination. And also they were going to raise money in this telethon to put it towards another investigation into the death of JFK. And this is really super interesting to me because, as I mentioned, Freddie Prinze was just absolutely massively popular right around this time, in particular in the Latino community. And he would have had a lot of influence and sway over that community. So, if he really was going to do this telethon, he could have got a lot of people behind it and a lot of people involved. And Freddie Prinze did commit suicide just a very short while after he'd told Mark Lane about this plan of his and while he was trying to put it together. So it's definitely really suspicious timing. And another interesting thing I learned about the Freddie Prinze death after I did the video has to do with Tony Orlando. So I want to talk about this real quick. And Tony Orlando was a very, very popular singer and artist at the time, very, very successful. And he was also Freddie Prinze's best friend. They had grown up in the same neighborhood in New York City, and they were both Puerto Rican. So they were very, very close. And it was said that Tony Orlando was just totally devastated by the death of Freddie Prinze. And after the death of Freddie Prinze, Tony Orlando just started acting like really erratic and really crazy. And he would, kind of behave erratically during concerts. And then he abruptly announced that he was just flat out retiring from the entertainment industry, which seemed like a really odd thing because he was very young and he was still very successful. And then he was admitted to a mental asylum and he stayed there for a couple months. And then after he got out of this mental asylum, he gave all these interviews about Freddie Prinze's death and how, Freddie Prinze had a suicide wish. And he was just kind of like mentally unstable, and he just kind of parroted and repeated the official story, didn't make any noise about there might being like more to his suicide or the official story might not be accurate. He just kept reiterating this official story. And I did find it a little odd how, Tony Orlando and Freddie Prinze were just so close, and Freddie Prinze dies, and then Tony Orlando has this mysterious visit to a psychiatric ward. And then after he does that, he comes out and talks about how, Freddie Prinze had always been suicidal, and it wasn't that big of a surprise that it had happened. It seemed a little strange. Wonder if there was a little maybe more going on with this psychiatric ward visit that he did. And as far as Freddie Prinze Jr. goes, he does seem pretty normal. He'd never been involved in anything too scandalous or anything like that. He's not really involved even in Hollywood anymore. Maybe that's why he's, a pretty normal guy. But I was curious if he'd ever like looked into his father's death or ever given any interviews about not really believing the official story. I really couldn't find much about that. It seems like anytime he ever talked about it, he just kind of accepted the official story, and that was that. But the whole Freddie Prinze story is definitely one of these stranger, more mysterious stories out there in Hollywood. And like I mentioned, it's just never talked about. Most people have no idea who he is. So definitely check out that longer video that I did. I'll link it in the description. Definitely check that out to learn more. And next up is an update to David Crosby of Crosby, Stills, and Nash fame. So I went over David Crosby's just really incredible background in part two, but I learned a lot more about him since then. A lot of people left some really good comments pointing some of this stuff out. And a lot of it's really interesting. So I wanted to add a few things about him. So, real quick, if you haven't seen that other video, David Crosby has this like amazing lineage where he's related to just all these powerful aristocratic families who were kings, rulers, senators, politicians, a whole bunch of stuff. He's related to Robert Coe, who basically helped build the United States back in the day. And if you look at a list of Robert Coe's famous descendants, it's kind of funny. There's all these like famous major politicians, the Bush family, Winston Churchill, whole bunch of others. And then David Crosby is just randomly thrown in there. And David Crosby's father was a high-ranking military intelligence officer. So it's definitely a background you wouldn't really think for this like counterculture rock star. And you always hear about bloodlines and how important those are to the elites, and how if you don't have like a royal bloodline, you almost aren't allowed to succeed past a certain point. And that's really interesting because when Melissa Etheridge announced that she was having a baby with her partner back in the mid 90s, there was this big mystery over who the sperm donor was. And they eventually revealed that David Crosby was the one who was the baby's father, which most people felt was a really odd choice for a sperm donor because, she was Melissa Etheridge and she was rich and famous and could have had basically anyone. It was long rumored that Brad Pitt was the sperm donor, George Clooney, a couple other like really prominent actors and well-known people. Those people would have made sense because they have great genes and they're, fit and good looking. So it would have made sense to go someone like that, but instead they chose David Crosby, who was just this, fat, old, short guy, not very good genes. He's always had severe alcohol and drug problems, mental problems. So it didn't really make much sense that of all the people they could have chosen, they chose David Crosby, unless it was the bloodline they were after, and that, is the reason they chose him. Anyway, I covered all that in the video I already did, so I'll link that in the description. Now for the new stuff, and we'll stay with the theme of him being the sperm donor for Melissa Etheridge, because David Crosby died a few years ago. And after he died, Melissa Etheridge came out and said it wasn't just her that David Crosby had donated sperm for, that he donated his sperm to all these other couples. And they were like discovering all these kids that David Crosby had out in the world. And it's kind of like a mystery about just how many people he donated sperm to, and just how many kids that he had out there. There's speculation that there could be like hundreds of kids out there. It's just a really strange story. But it actually reminded me of one of the more bizarre aspects of the Jeffrey Epstein ordeal, and that was the claim that Jeffrey Epstein was trying to quote unquote seed the human race with his DNA. And he was doing this by attempting to impregnate just dozens of girls at a time. And the official story, at least, claims he was doing this to create a super race of humans with his DNA. So it was one of the stranger aspects of the whole Jeffrey Epstein ordeal. And it honestly really reminded me of what David Crosby was apparently doing. I don't exactly know what is going on here, but it's definitely strange. And another really strange aspect to David Crosby comes from his autobiography, where he tells a story about something that happened to him in the early 1970s. So he was sailing the world in his yacht, and at the Panama Canal, they docked the yacht, and it just so happened that they were near a military base. Remember that his father was a high ranking military intelligence officer. And the story that David Crosby tells in his autobiography is that he went to the bar one night to use the payphone, and he was confronted by a guy from the military base, and this guy called him a hippie son of a bitch and all these things and got in his face. And David Crosby says in his autobiography, he says, quote, that he thought, gee, there's a nice cliff right there. I wish this guy would just walk over and step off. This is somebody that the world doesn't need. And David Crosby claims that he left the bar because he felt uncomfortable by this. And then he went back the next morning. And I'll just read this part here. He says, when I came back the next morning to pay for my fuel bill, I asked the club secretary who the obnoxious guy was. And she said, he's the FBI head of security for the base. But he died last night of a heart attack. So that's definitely pretty weird. You do wonder if good old David Crosby is telling us the full story here, or if there might be a little more to it. Definitely pretty strange that the guy just ended up dead after confronting David Crosby. And another strange thing has to do with Drew Barrymore. So it's pretty well documented that Drew Barrymore just lived this really major party lifestyle as a kid. And at 14 years old, she entered rehab for substance abuse. And after she was released, it was David Crosby who she went and lived with. And David Crosby claimed that he was battling drug addiction himself, so he thought it'd be, and he knew her, the psychiatrist that she'd been meeting with, and so he thought it'd be a good thing to do to take Drew Barrymore in and have him live with her for a few months after she got released from rehab. Definitely kind of an odd thing. And then another comment that a few people had made was that John Todd mentions David Crosby in a few lectures. John Todd was this guy who claimed to be majorly involved with like the Illuminati or a really powerful group like that. And then he defected and gave all these lectures and talks about, the things he'd experienced. He talked in particular a lot about the music industry, and multiple people had mentioned that he talks about David Crosby. I couldn't find like a transcript of his talks, and there are quite a few of them out there, so I didn't have the time really to go through and listen to them all. But apparently he does mention David Crosby, so if anybody out there knows kind of what he says, definitely drop a comment, because I'm very curious myself. But I just wanted to run through a few things about David Crosby. Let me know if you have any more. He was definitely quite the character. And next up is Justin Trudeau, who was Prime Minister of Canada. And I would say he qualifies as a celebrity, even though he's a politician. He's always in the news, been on a lot of magazine covers. This Rolling Stone feature on him here has the headline, "Why Can't He Be Our President?" which is possibly the most hilariously out of touch magazine headline of all time. And he comes from a really bizarre background. His father was Pierre Trudeau, who was Prime Minister of Canada himself for 15 years, and his wife, Margaret Trudeau, who he married when he was 51 and she was 22. And Margaret Trudeau is the really interesting one because she was just a party animal for a while, and she had a stretch where she was just constantly in the news for partying and dating all these celebrities: Jack Nicholson, the Rolling Stones, Ted Kennedy, whole bunch of famous names. And as you can see in these pictures, they really were quite the odd couple with the 30-year age difference. And just the official story of their relationship is honestly ridiculous. And it definitely seems like there is way, way more going on here, because there are a lot of red flags here. And the first thing that seems a little odd is the story of how they met. So Margaret Sinclair was her maiden name, and she was the daughter of Jimmy Sinclair, who was a Canadian politician who was mentioned as being a potential candidate for the Canadian Prime Minister himself. And in 1967, this Jimmy Sullivan took his 5 daughters on a Christmas vacation trip to a resort on the island of Moorea in the Pacific Ocean. Margaret was 18 at the time, and it just so happened that Pierre Trudeau was also vacationing at this exact same resort at the same time. And the story goes that he'd gone on vacation to contemplate running for Prime Minister of Canada. And he was 47 years old at the time, and he met 18-year-old Margaret Sinclair on this trip, and they apparently spent all this time together on this vacation. So it's just kind of your classic love story of taking a nice vacation to contemplate running for prime minister and meeting a girl 30 years younger than you and spending the whole trip with her. I'm sure it's happened to everyone out there. I know it happens to me all the time, but anyway, after the vacation, Pierre Trudeau ended up running for prime minister and he won. And after about a year, the official story goes that Pierre Trudeau randomly called up the Sinclair house and said that he wanted to go on a date with Margaret. She was 20 and he was 48. And the official story says that she was going to turn down the date with the prime minister of the freaking country because she didn't have anything to wear, but she eventually agreed. And after that, they supposedly dated in secret for 2 years, and then all of a sudden in 1971, they announced their marriage to the world, and she just instantly became this big celebrity. She was constantly in the news. Obviously, the 30-year age gap was what everyone kind of focused on and poked fun at. And then they had Justin Trudeau and two other kids, and then they separated in 1977, and Margaret Trudeau just went wild. There were all these stories about how she was partying with the Rolling Stones in Canada, and then she flew to New York to party with them some more. She was linked to a whole bunch of celebrities during this time. Jack Nicholson, there's this quote here where she talks about her affair with Jack Nicholson and says that they spent time discovering just how much room there is in the back of an automobile. She was linked to Ryan O'Neal, who was a big deal at the time, linked to Ted Kennedy, linked to Lou Rawls, who was a famous singer. So there was a lot of dudes in her life around this time. And she was also a regular at Studio 54. And on the eve of the 1979 Canadian election, she was photographed partying at Studio 54 the night before the election, which Pierre Trudeau lost. And eventually she was admitted to a mental asylum to get treatment, and this was a very common theme throughout her life. There's all these references of time that she spent in mental facilities throughout her life. She was in and out of them for a very long time. One of the stays was for over 2 months. Another time she was put in a straitjacket. And then later in life, she was hospitalized again, and she came out and said that she had bipolar disorder. And it honestly seems like similar to Mariah Carey, there was some serious MK Ultra type mind control going on with her. Canada back then was a real hotbed for mind experiments. There was this guy right here. His name was Dr. Ewan Cameron, and he was involved with MK Ultra and the US government. And he did, you can find lists online, he just did a whole bunch of just horrific mind experiments on people, isolation tanks, and just administered so many drugs, even to children. You can find a lot out there about him. He's a pretty evil guy, and he was right in Canada. And again, Margaret Sinclair, which was her maiden name, she was the daughter of James Sinclair, who was a very prominent Canadian politician, was even mentioned as a candidate for prime minister. So she was from a really successful, well-off, connected family. And it seems like a lot of times it's children from families like that who get involved in this mind control MK Ultra experimentation that's going on. And if you read up on these mind control programs, one thing that's always talked about is how the programming tends to wear off after a while. And these people who are subjected to it have to go in to be quote unquote like refreshed from time to time. Almost like a car tune up. And it's talked about how a lot of times this is done under the cover of someone being admitted to a mental asylum or to rehab, and that's the cover. But what's really going on is that they're getting their programming reinforced. Margaret Trudeau, like I mentioned, definitely fits that bill. She was always in and out of mental facilities for her entire life. And Justin Trudeau himself is no stranger to controversies. Definitely the most famous one is the controversy over whether Fidel Castro is his father. And if you just look at Pierre Trudeau, I mean, he looks absolutely nothing like Justin Trudeau. And if you look at Fidel, I mean, they really do look very alike, almost identical. And there is a connection between the Trudeaus and Fidel Castro because in 1976, the Trudeaus famously visited Cuba during an embargo that the United States had placed on Cuba. And this was a big deal because this was the first leader of a Western country to show support for Cuba and defy the United States embargo. And it was estimated that 250,000 Cubans showed up to listen to Trudeau speak. And it was all over the news at the time. There was even a book written about it here. And it was said that the Trudeaus basically idolized Fidel Castro and his politics. Clearly, Margaret Trudeau got around, and you just look at pictures and how she's embracing Fidel Castro. Definitely pretty suspicious, but this trip was in 1976, and Justin Trudeau was officially born in 1971. So the dates don't really add up, but obviously they could have met out of the public eye way before this. So the question that people ask is always, is Fidel Castro Justin Trudeau's father? But I think a more interesting question is Justin Trudeau a human clone of Fidel Castro? Human cloning is such a fascinating topic. It was a huge, huge deal and was just talked about everywhere for a stretch back in the late 1960s and early 1970s. All these articles here are from 50 plus years ago, and they talked about how it was only a matter of time, only a matter of short time before cloning a human would be possible. And there's all these quotes from these leading scientists back then. Again, this is from over 50 years ago about how the process, they talked about how the process to create a human clone was actually very easy. All you needed was a cell from a person, and you could create a clone of that person in a lab. And then there's also this movie, Boys from Brazil, that I've talked about in a few videos. The plot of the movie is that the Nazis who escaped during World War II were creating hundreds of clones of Adolf Hitler using his DNA in the hopes that these clones would one day lead a revival of the Third Reich once they were older. So you do wonder if certain groups who really admired Fidel Castro did the same thing with him. It's definitely a real interesting wrinkle to the whole Justin Trudeau, Fidel Castro conspiracy. Definitely a massive, massive rabbit hole that I won't really explore too much in this video, but I do think it's a real interesting possibility, and I just never see it talked about. There's a ton out there about Fidel Castro being his father, but you never really see anything mentioned about Justin Trudeau potentially being a clone of Fidel Castro. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Likes, shares, and comments are always appreciated. A lot of people left some really great comments on the first two videos in this series that I did, left some really good suggestions of other people to look into. And lastly, big shout out to the members here on YouTube and on Patreon. Thank you so much for your support. I truly greatly appreciate it. Really means a lot. So thanks again. Thank you so much again. Hope you all enjoyed this video, and we'll see you soon with another one.